J. Warner Wallace is an award-winning detective who has been featured on Dateline more than any other homicide investigator. He's the best-selling author of numerous books, including Cold Case Christianity, Person of Interest, Forensic Faith, and God's Crime Scene. He's an adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University and a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And he's a faculty member at Summit Ministries. Jay, thanks so much for joining me on Takeaway.
So glad to be with you. So glad to be with you.
A homicide detective. Now, what led you into that profession?
You know, my dad was a police officer for about 30 years before I came on the job. And he has my name, we have the same name. And my son followed me on the job with the same name. So we've been at that agency for 62 years. So I just followed in my dad's footsteps.
At age 35, if I understand correctly, you were an atheist. Mm-hmm. You were happy as could be. You had a meaningful career. You have a loving family, plenty of friends. You made a big change in your life away from atheism. Why? Was there something else missing? What was wrong?
Nothing missing. My wife was interested. We weren't raised around Christians. So no one invited me to church growing up. I didn't have friends that, were Christians. I think my wife was more willing to ask the question, now that we're raising kids, should we raise them with some set of structural, beliefs? And I thought, well, my dad's the same way. He's not a believer. He would have been happy to go to church, though, with a spouse who wanted to go to church. He would just go as a non-believer. And so I thought, well, I'll go. And this pastor, that first day we went to church, he pitched Jesus in a way that I could catch him. He just said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived, the most important historical figure of all history. I mean, whatever he said, I remember thinking, is that true?
Tell me, what was the aha moment that brought you to Christ out of atheism?
I work cold cases primarily.
Right.
It is a cumulative case of 1,000 pieces of what might not seem like the biggest deal, but in isolation,
but collectively,
they are powerful. And so that was how I built the case for Christianity. Boy, it took me a while.
What are some of the similarities between investigating cold cases, homicides, and investigating the claims of Christianity?
Okay, so in cold cases, typically, I've got a notebook I open up, and some detective went out and interviewed an eyewitness. And that witness is no longer available to me because this case is 40 years old. Unfortunately, that witness is dead.
Can't talk to that guy.
Can't talk to the witness. And sometimes the officer who took the report is also no longer available to me. So now I've got a report in which I have no access to the witness or the report taker. Well, that's the Gospels. Luke is writing a report, allegedly, from the eyewitnesses and servants of the word, but I have no access to those
And it's a cold case because it happened so long ago, it's not a fresh, hot case.
Right. Well, one thing for sure, you're going to assemble these cases the same way. They're on the basis of a cumulative collection of evidences that point to the same reasonable inference.
Okay, all right.
So that's how I built it. I just needed to know. And look, we test eyewitnesses with a certain process. And I don't trust eyewitnesses. Witnesses lie. And that's often, I've been caught in jury trials where a guy said something all the way until we get to trial, then suddenly he changes his mind. No. So I don't trust anyone, but I test them. If they pass the test, well, then I trust them. So I simply applied that test to the gospel authors to see if I could trust what they were saying about Jesus.
What's the test?
Well, it's based on in our state, 13 jury instruction questions that we allow jurors to think about when they're listening to eyewitnesses. But it comes down to 4 broad categories.
Okay.
Number 1, were they really there to see what they said they saw? Number 2, can they be corroborated in some way? Number 3, have they changed their story over time? And number 4, do they have a motive to lie to me, a bias, some reason to tell me a lie? If I can get them through those 4 hurdles, well, then I know I can go to trial with those witnesses because they are really telling me the truth. They really were there. They can be corroborated in some way, and they don't have no motive to lie to me. So that's what I'm looking for in eyewitnesses. And I thought, well, I didn't have any other way in. For a lot of years, I thought, doesn't every Christian do something like this? Like why would you believe Christianity is true without going through this process? But a lot of it was that's just the way that I examine these kinds of
which
claims.
I think is so fascinating and helpful. It's intriguing to me. I tend to look at many things in my life through the lens of a production, right? I mean,
that's right.
Even what I decide to put on in the morning, I think, does the wardrobe department, would they approve of this?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Or that I'm directing the plan that I have for my marriage and for my family, and each of the people in my family are playing a very significant role. And I often have lines and plots scripted out for us. And if we all just follow the director, things will go well. That doesn't always work well in marriage. So I have to take that lens off at times and put on a biblical lens.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Of compassion,
Yes.
of submission and
Yes.
other things. But for you, you're looking at Christianity through the lens of a homicide detective. I think that's fascinating.
Well, and a lot of it, you're right about having to take off certain attributes of our job. So for me, a part of the thing I have to take off is a really deep-rooted skepticism that I have about everyone.
Yeah, because you've seen the worst of the worst, and people lie to
Yeah.
your face, and that can be devastating if you don't catch it.
Right, and so I'm always assuming that everyone's a liar until I'm proven otherwise. And I assumed the same thing about the Gospels when I first opened them up. So it's just practically powerful for us as detectives to assume the worst in people. And most of the time when people ask me a question, what they're really asking is, Jim, what am I missing here? What's the lie that I'm missing? I can tell you this, the same way you have to take off that production filter, that actor filter to put on a biblical worldview, we have to do the same thing as cops, right? So sadly, often what we do, especially working homicides, is you draw a very tight circle around the people for whom you're willing to cry. And so that's the struggle, I think, for a lot of us who are working in this job is how do we wear a biblical lens?
Jay, you talk about how you were trained in forensic statement analysis as part of your tools to be able to determine, who done it.
Right.
So how does that apply to the witness statements in the gospel about Jesus?
Well, so every word matters in forensic statement analysis, not just the words you might say, but the words you could have said but chose not to. So I'm looking at options. So I'm always looking at the words that are optional words that don't need to be said. So for the most part, adjectives and adverbs are optional words. You never need to use them. So if I have a clicker for my computer and I tell you, okay, this is my gray clicker, what am I really telling you? I'm telling you I have more than one clicker, because why am I using the optional word gray? I don't need that word gray. I can just say this is my clicker. You can see it. You can see it. Who knows how many I have, but this one's the gray one. So when you're examining the words that people use and how they compress time and extend time and how they use personal pronouns, how am I describing you? How are you describing me? That tells you something about the intent of whoever is talking. I just took that process and I applied it to the Gospels and looked for those words that would give away a perspective, perhaps, like for example, in early history, there's a church father named Papias who says that Peter was preaching in Rome and that Mark was his scribe, was sitting at his feet listening to Peter's preaching, and from that he wrote the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so I said, if that's true, I should find Peter's fingerprints in the Gospel of Mark forensically. So that was one of the very first things I started to do, is to look and see if I could trust that this was really from Peter, because who's Mark? Mark was not an eyewitness. Why should I trust? Well, maybe he's scribing for an eyewitness. Well, how would I know that? Look at it forensically. So a lot of it for me was trying to figure out, number one, did this really happen? Are these really eyewitness accounts? Number two, could I test them in a way to make sure they haven't had facts added or additional details added? Like, how do I know these are the same stories that they were originally there in the first century? That kind of thing. How early were these written? I needed to know that kind of stuff before I could step off and say, and by the way, that does not give you belief in Jesus. That just gives you belief that.
In the credibility of the eyewitness.
Yeah, just gives you
So should I even listen to these people who say that they're eyewitnesses, and is this lining up, and is there credibility here?
That's right.
And then you talk about how you need to actually determine whether or not the explanation they're giving for the events is the most believable explanation that Jesus really did rise from the grave. That's a difficult one to believe. And you talk about and expand on this for us. Feasibility, straightforwardness, and exhaustiveness.
Yeah, okay, so this is about abductive reasoning, right? We do this for every jury. We're going to offer a version of what we think happened. And so the defense may offer a version. You've got to figure out. Two different
explanations, same facts, different explanations.
That's right. So what I always say, you make two lists. One's a list of all the evidence. The other is a list of all the explanations. And then you're referring back and forth between your evidence and explanations, crossing out the explanations that don't really work given the evidence. I did the same thing with the resurrection. Look, there are certain data points we could look at. What do you believe is really true? At the very minimal data points. Yes, that Jesus lived, that maybe he died on a cross, that people said he rose from the grave. Well, then how do I explain that phenomena? Well, there's like 7 ways to explain it, and 6 are not Christian ways.
One is it's a legend.
He's lying about it.
He's lying about it. Church fathers later made the whole story up.
Exactly. So I looked at all those and just said, okay, what makes the best sense? Now, every explanation has strengths and weaknesses. This is true even when I have the true defendant in a trial. Yes, my case is strong, but it has weaknesses. Well, this is true for even the truth. So the Christian explanation, I think, is by far the strongest, but it has a weakness. It requires a resurrection to occur. And for me, that was a step too far. I was a philosophical naturalist. I could believe all of the things in the Bible that don't require a miracle.
Yeah.
But once we get to miracle stuff, I'm out. But then I had to ask myself, okay, this is why I simultaneously was investigating the evidence in the universe. Do I have good reason to believe that there is a God that is capable of a miracle before I start reading the Gospels? And if you look at the evidence in the universe, the fact
There is
that
ample evidence for
the fact that we are in a universe that has a beginning already forces us outside of space, time, and matter to look for the cause of space, time, and matter.
That's right.
That's not my claim. That is a claim in Genesis 1, but it's a claim of cosmologists. The standard cosmological model is still Big Bang cosmology, that everything, all space, time, and matter, came from nothing. Now, whether you accept or reject that, as an atheist, that was my view. That I believed that the evidence demonstrated that everything in the universe came from nothing. Well, hold on then. So how do I explain that? I need a cause. The only question is the cause personal or impersonal?
Yeah.
And if it's a personal being, then the most amazing miracle in Scripture is Genesis 1, everything from nothing. All the New Testament miracles are small potato miracles compared to Genesis 1. So I just knew I had to read that text with an open hand.
That's such a good point. You also talk about the need for the explanation of the facts. We're talking about the Gospels again, and cold case homicides, to also be an explanation that is logical and is superior to the other explanations.
Yeah.
But the resurrection is not, it defies logic as we think of it naturalistically.
Yes, but it's only logically consistent if you know there's a being
there's a God who could actually do that, then it is logical.
That could enter. Yeah, now it's within the range of reasonable because you've already, and that's why, I think there's actually 8 attributes of the universe that can only be explained by a personal being outside of space, time, and matter. So once I got to that point, I thought, okay, now I need to read the Gospels through that lens, a little differently.
That doesn't mean that God did it. That doesn't mean Jesus rose, but now it means I can't exclude those as possible causes and something that would make possible this Christian explanation for the fact.
I thought, okay, what if the room is the natural universe, all space, time, and matter? Can I explain everything that's in that room by staying in the room? If I can.
I know. No, you cannot.
No, you cannot. And there's 8 things. There's the beginning of the universe has to be explained. The fine-tuning we see in the universe has to be explained. The appearance of life from non-life in the universe has to be explained. The appearance of design in biology has to be explained. The fact that we have consciousness, we have a mind.
A mind outside of
and we experience free agency.
The hardware, there is software and programming.
That's right. Also, we have a standard of righteousness that we measure evil against. Yeah. And finally, we have objective moral values that we all embrace. Okay, so how do I explain those? Can I get that stuff with space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry?
Right.
No.
Being inside the room of the universe, can we explain where these things come from?
No, you can't. And the most that people will say, the most I would have said as a non-believer was, well, I can't explain it, but someday science will be able to.
That's right. And we're not going to leap to the God option because that's just fairy tales and,
but trust me, if
fairies.
you're leaping to a future explanation, if it's not God of the gaps, it's science of the gaps. It's the same, you're leaping to something you don't have access to.
That's right. And you're building your worldview on a miracle that is far greater than anything of the magnitude of a resurrection or a virgin birth.
That's
you're talking about the universe coming out of nothing.
Yeah.
You're saying nobody times nothing equals everything. And you're standing on that as a philosophical naturalist.
Yes, and you're trying to make all your decisions on that basis when a universe clearly doesn't care about you at all. There's no right, there's no wrong. So it's not like I'm jumping to God for no. He is the by far best explanation for the genetic information.
Jay, what did Jesus think about evidence versus that just sort of feelings-based blind faith?
Okay, so let me just say this. Jesus is a master evidentialist. And how do you know this? Because he says, like in the Gospel of John, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, folks, at least believe on the evidence of these miracles.
That's right.
He points to both direct evidence, which is eyewitness statements of the Father and of John the Baptist.
That's right.
It has indirect evidence, right. He points to the indirect evidence of he spends 40 days with the disciples after the resurrection, showing them many convincing proofs, and the word proof in the Greek is the word we use for evidence, showing them 40 days of evidence. And then he assigns who gets to talk about Jesus in the book of Acts? Who is an apostle? Eyewitnesses. As a matter of fact, they replaced Judas with another eyewitness in Acts 1, somebody who had seen the risen Christ all the way from the baptism to the resurrection. That's an eyewitness. That's direct evidence. Now, here's what I would say about it. Yes, there's a step we call a step of faith. Here's what it is. When I get in front of a jury, I tell the jury all the time, I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know, but not everything that could be known. Because even I don't know always why he killed her or how he killed her, but I can demonstrate that he killed her. So I will say this to the jury. I'm not going to be, if you have to make a step across your unanswered questions, here's what I'll do for you though. I'm going to give you an evidence trail that's going to point right to the defendant. It's not going to point a foot to the left or a foot to the right. It's going to point right to him, but it's going to stop short because those are all of our unanswered questions. We all have them. I have them. You have them.
Right.
But I'm going to lead you right up to him. I'm going to ask you to take a step, which we call rendering a verdict. When it comes to Jesus, same thing. We've got more than enough evidence. You've got to render a verdict. It doesn't point a foot to the left or a foot to the right. But that step is called a step of faith, and it's going to be across your unanswered questions. But trust me, there is nothing for which you don't already have an unanswered question.
What is the difference between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence?
Okay, so you get, people say all the time, there's no hard evidence for Christianity. No, there isn't, because hard evidence is not a category. There's no hard evidence for anything. We don't talk about, in criminal trials, hard and soft evidence. Those aren't categories. There's only two categories of evidence, direct and indirect. Direct evidence is an eyewitness account, somebody who saw it happen.
Right.
Indirect evidence is everything else. Indirect is DNA, gunshot residue, blood spatter evidence, fingerprints. Those are all indirect evidences. Now, it turns out there's another word for indirect evidence. It's called circumstantial evidence. So if it's not an eyewitness, it's circumstantial. DNA is circumstantial evidence. When it comes to direct evidence, it's a matter of, well, can I test the eyewitness? And that's what I had to do with the Gospels. Indirect evidence, the question is, do I have the most reasonable inference from the indirect evidence?
What do you do when your witnesses contradict each other, as it appears to be the case in the Bible, when you've got Luke saying there's two angels at the tomb for Jesus, and you've got Mark saying there's one angel at the tomb?
Right.
Is that a contradiction of witnesses?
It might be, or it might not be. Now, of course, in Scripture, I think that you can resolve these alleged contradictions because this is not uncommon. I don't have access to the witnesses to ask good follow-up questions.
That's right, because it's a cold case.
It's a cold case.
It happened a long time ago.
So I have to deal with these. When we finally get to trial, believe me, the defense attorney is going to make a big deal out of these differences.
Right.
But the reality of it is, wherever there's two angels, there's also one. And if all my point in this gospel...
but you just said that. Wherever there's two angels, there's also
always going to be one.
Right? There's one right there, and there's one right there.
Yeah, so if I'm only talking about the one I was speaking to, so I came up and I spoke to this angel, there may have been a second angel there, but why wouldn't I mention the second angel? Well, this is so common in eyewitness accounts. A lot of what we bring into the account is our set of desires, our experiences, our personal histories.
Where your focus is.
Yes, what our focus is. So, for example, if I've got a set of eyewitnesses and I'm interested in what is that guy wearing precisely, I'm probably not asking the guy. I'm probably asking the female witness, because sometimes they'll notice details that a guy won't notice. When people say, well, yeah, but how could this be the inerrant word of God? Okay, if what God was trying to do was give us a set of 4 accounts that utterly could be tested as eyewitness accounts, he did a great job, because that's exactly what we have. Mm-hmm. Everything is reconcilable.
Each in their own unique way.
That's right.
Telling the same story from their perspective.
Each unique perspective, in their own language.
Does the fact that some of these eyewitnesses laid down their lives willingly, does that add credibility to their testimony?
For you and I, if we said as Christians in this century that we are willing to die for what we believe is true about Jesus, it would have zero evidential value, because lots of people are willing to die for what they don't know is a lie. But if this is the one generation, the first century eyewitnesses, who would know if it's a lie, if they are willing to die for it, it has high evidential value.
Why would they know if it was a lie?
Well, because they were allegedly said they saw this.
They saw Jesus rise from the grave.
Right. If they didn't really see it and they're just lying about it.
Yeah, why would you die for that? Because you know that.
You might get one to do that. But this is what's amazing about this. There's a history of martyrdom within the early church, which is pretty well described. It's in the book of Acts, so you see it early in the pages of Scripture. You see it in the accounts that follow Scripture of all the martyrdoms' death, all the apostles' deaths, and you see it in the early lives of the followers of the apostles who wrote that, yes, I'm willing to die for this because I saw the eyewitnesses die for it. So that tradition of martyrdom in the early church, I think, establishes, it's only one piece though. I would never say, well, that's the reason. No, it's not. That's not the reason. It's that plus all of the other stuff. Yeah. So you're making a cumulative case on those 4 legs. Is it early enough to have been written by an eyewitness? Can it be corroborated through any number of external and internal corroborations? Has it changed over time? And do they possess a bias, a reason to lie? Motive.
Yeah.
Motive is a big deal. There's only 3 reasons why anyone lies. The first one is it's money, greed, sex.
Yeah.
But that third one, the pursuit of power, actually is the stuff that even you and we have to protect ourselves against that.
Yeah.
Pride, authority, respect, achievement.
Yeah.
These are the things that move us.
And laying down their life, that wasn't getting them power.
Well, some skeptics would say, well, yeah, but they were nobodies. And then they started saying they saw the risen Christ. They became somebodies. It's a power thing. Well, hold on. So Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, he starts off in a position of authority, power, and respect with a larger group called the Jews, with all kinds of it. One of the best teachers was his teacher, and he had the authority to draw papers against Christians. You're telling me that one day he wakes up and he says, I'm going to jump out of this position of authority, power, and respect that I have right now. I'm going to join a smaller group where I'm going to basically get beat up for the next 30 years all over the empire, hoping someday to return to what I already have.
That's right.
That to me is it possible? Look, there's a difference between possible and reasonable.
Yeah.
I'm open to possibilities, but in the end, I have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's just not a reasonable explanation.
Because you have seen some of the worst things committed by people, knowing as a Christian that there is a God in heaven who has observed these things happening on his watch. Has that ever made you doubt your faith in God?
No, because I wasn't raised with a faith in God. I had to come to my belief in God through those doubts. In other words, I was the guy on the other side.
Saying, if there's all this evil in the world, how could there be a God?
Give me a break. But it turns out there's lots of reasons why any murder occurs. It's a collective case. All these circumstances took to line up before that young person died. I get it. Well, in explaining any act of evil, it's a collective. Why would God allow this? Well, there's a series of reasons why he might. I'll say one, though, right away for me. As an atheist, my idea of life was a line segment. You're born, and then you live till you die. That's a line segment, 2 dots, birth and death. But if I was wrong, by the way, all evil, if I got sick halfway through and died of cancer, I would be upset because that would be evil. Why would God allow that to happen to me? What if life is not a line segment? Instead, it's a ray that starts at birth, goes to that point called death, but then extends infinitely into the future. Well, it turns out that every year on the other side of the second dot, now that space called 90 years in the line segment seems shorter. If you're 1,000,000 years into eternity, that
your
90
life is
years
just a blip.
Whatever experience we have that we're calling evil has to be measured in the context of the ray of eternity. That's just one of, I think, maybe 6 or 7 reasons why I can understand why God would allow this. Look, God, it's not just that God's all-powerful and all-loving. There's a third dimension they always leave out. He's also all-knowing. Yeah. He understands how everything that happens in our lives is connected to the other butterfly effect over all of the history of humanity.
That's right.
I don't understand.
That's right. He's the great author, and he's the blessed controller of all things, working all things together good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. How do you explain the most innocent man, the most morally perfect man, being crucified on the cross unjustly and say that that was good? We call that Good Friday as Christians because the author has Sunday.
That's right.
2 days later.
Yes, he understands what's
he
coming.
understands the big picture.
That's right.
Jay, we could talk for hours. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For coming on and talking about cold case Christianity.